Yo guys, and welcome back to part 2 of the Camp Scott murders. If you didn't get a chance to watch the first one, I will link to that. But I want to say this, to do a detailed documentary in this case would literally take months, and the cooperation of many people, including the families and friends of the victims. I would have to talk to local newspapers, law enforcement, past and present. However, there were several complexities of this case, and that is what I'll focus on in this video. And this video is far from comprehensive, and there is so much more to this case. If you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing. Hit the like button if you like this video and turn on your notifications so you can be notified when I upload more videos. I will give you an overview of the murders once again because I feel like it ties everything together. Camp Scott in Locust Grove, Oklahoma played host to probably as many as 800 Girl Scouts every year. But on June 13th, 1977, the campfire stories of the boogeyman became real. Murdered in the night, only 150 yards from their counselor's tent and only a few yards from 7 other tents, 3 girls were murdered somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m. A person or persons entered the back of the tent where the 3 girls were sleeping, and all 3 were hit with some kind of a blunt object, possibly killing 2 of the girls instantly. The 3rd would be bound, gagged, and made to walk to the edge of the camp road. She was raped and strangled to death, and she was left on top of her sleeping bag, mostly naked, while the other 2 girls were zipped up in their sleeping bags. All 3 were left in a pile like unwanted clothes. What would later ensue was the largest manhunt in Oklahoma history. There were tracking dogs, helicopters, police, infrared sensors. Hundreds of private citizens got involved. A suspect who had escaped from jail some 4 years earlier, who was serving time on 2 rape charges, was finally apprehended. A one Gene Leroy Hart stood trial and was ultimately exonerated of the murders. He would go back to prison to finish his rape sentences. But Gene Leroy Hart unexpectedly dropped dead of a heart attack just 2 months after he returned to prison. There are 3 books on this case. One is called Tent Number 8. The other one is called Someone Cry for the Children, which I know is out of print. Another one simply called The Camp Scott Murders. But how many people were checked out for this murder? Well, dozens. There were all sorts of people who confessed to the crime. Even the most far-fetched stories, though, were checked out. Several people who confessed were mentally ill or claimed to have been incarcerated with the real killer. One man even drew maps and gave a detailed timeline saying he had the cooperation of one of the counselors. Now, there was some speculation at one point in time that one of the counselors had their boyfriend staying there, and that there was some speculation that the counselor and this boyfriend acted together to carry out these murders. Well, unless that boyfriend was Gene Leroy Hart, that's probably not true. Self-proclaimed psychics sent detailed descriptions of the killer, with some even sending illustrations and elaborate details, but nothing ever really matched the actual crime. But during the months leading to the capture of Gene Leroy Hart, several entities tried tracking him. Members of the 12th Force Reconnaissance Army Group searched that forest many times. A team of Vietnam veterans called the Spooks said they could capture Hart within a week. They emerged just days later, tired, hungry, and covered with ticks. They too had 0 luck. A clinical psychologist by the name of Dr. Robert Phillips gave an overall picture of Hart, and he described him in the following way. Very dark and depressed, that he hates life and feels inferior. He fears rejection, especially from women. He hates happiness, innocence, and decency. And the best way to degrade those things was to sexually molest and kill 3 innocent girls. He was not legally crazy, and he survives on an animal level, yet is calculated, plans his deed, and carries them out in an almost demonic way. A cave was discovered about 1.5 miles from Camp Scott. On the wall appeared to be a writing from maybe a marker that said the following: "The killer was here. Bye bye, fools." It was dated 77/6/17. That date arrangement is almost exclusively used in penitentiaries. Hart was thought to be thumbing his nose at authorities. By month 9 of the investigation, Hart, in spite of this horrible crime, had become somewhat of a folk hero in the area. It was thought that some of the locals, especially people who had known Hart, had possibly acted to help hide him from authorities in various ways. It was clear that once the OSBI and the FBI became involved, every bureau wanted to be the task force to take Hart down. Finally, on April 6, 1978, Gene Leroy Hart was captured. He was captured at a small cabin approximately 50 miles from Camp Scott. The home was owned by an elderly man named Sam Pigeon. Sam Pigeon was also a Cherokee medicine man. Here are some of the facts in the folklore that go with this. I want you to know that anytime a case goes unsolved for a long period of time, the lore of the case gets bigger and grows over time. However, much of the lore in this case began almost immediately. Here are the few oddities that were involved, some relevant to the actual perpetrator and some just odd. There are more, but here are some standout ones that happened right around the time of the murders. Here's one of the odd things that happened. There was a mix-up in tent number 8, and only 3 girls were assigned. Typically there was 4 girls, but the 4th girl, the counselors decided that the next day they would make the switch because of the storms.
You know, you were supposed to be like put into groups, and we met our tent mates, and then we were taken to the mess hall. They served us dinner, and then I think we were supposed to like have some kind of a group activity, but because the thunderstorm was coming, they just had us all go back to our tents and get to know our tent mates. And the counselors really didn't, as far as I can remember, didn't even come around and check on us much.
So that 4th girl never went to that tent that night, which is what saved her life. Her name has been kept confidential, and I'm not even sure she was ever informed of how close of a brush she came with death on that fateful night. At about 1:30 the night of the murders, there was a moaning and guttural sound heard in the area of tent number 8. Now this is what several people reported. A counselor went to investigate, but later the sound stopped. So she thought it was probably just some animal, and she returned back to her cot in her tent. 4 other campers also heard the sounds and also reported a light in the woods, but it was a dim light. During the investigation, security guards thought they saw a silhouette of a man in the woods. They did their best to investigate and went out and looked, but they found nothing. And when they returned on a set of steps, they discovered a wet plastic bag with shoes and pink socks in it. On the shoes was written Doris Milner, who of course was one of the victims. Remember, much of this lore goes along with the Native Americans in the area, specifically the Cherokee, who were involved in the case. There are some Native Americans who still to this day speak very little English and largely isolate themselves away from the modern world. It's hard to believe, but these indigenous people also have medicine men. Hart may have been part of an old Cherokee society known as the Kituas. It is believed by some that in this organization that there are people that are known as skinwalkers or shapeshifters who can alter their shapes at will to assume the characteristics of certain animals. The tracking dolls on more than one occasion would simply stop on the path of tracking Hart and look and gaze into the air as if Hart flew away. Sam Pigeon, who harbored Gene Hart in his home near Tailhole, Oklahoma, he is a medicine man. But there was another medicine man involved in the case, and this particular medicine man, who went by the name of Crying Wolf, actually helped the police and investigators during the investigation in several ways. Sometimes the shapeshifters or skinwalkers are called Stagony or Stagony, I'm not sure quite how to pronounce it. The belief in this transformation is quite prevalent. A great number of Cherokee people believe that a person can transform himself into another being. Supposedly, the medicine man that harbored Hart had put a curse on the dogs tracking Hart. 2 of the dogs actually did die. One from exhaustion, and the other one died running out in front of a car, which is very odd for a highly trained dog. Conversely, Crying Wolf, the other medicine man, said if Jean Leroy Hart was really the man who perpetrated this crime, that the gods would have his way with him. Just 2 months after he returned to prison, he suffered an apparent heart attack, and he died at 35 years old. There are several other stories, mostly fabricated, but some are worth noting. And since the end of the trial, people have come forward claiming to know who really did it. There have been newspaper articles, websites, forums, videos, TV documentaries, books, talks of movies, and recent DNA tests. But in the end, the case remains unsolved. Now, here are a few of the theories. There was an 18-year-old Jimmy Bryan who was murdered in July in 1971 in Cherokee County. That's an adjacent county. He was found a month afterward. It was supposedly over some marijuana deal. A man was arrested and convicted of the murder. However, there is steep speculation that Jimmy Bryan was also involved in the Camp Scott murder, along with Jean Leroy Hart. He owned a pair of military boots, size 9, with a tread like what was found on the 10th floor of the murdered victim's tent. There was another unsolved Girl Scout murder. That was of 16-year-old Margaret Beck, and this was years earlier. Margaret, or Peggy Beck, was 16 at the time and a camp counselor at the Flying G Ranch Girl Scout camp in August of 1963. This is near Denver, Colorado. Margaret was found bound, gagged, raped, and killed on August 18th in her tent and wrapped in her sleeping bag. There were initially 3 suspects, but none of them checked out, and there have been no further suspects that have ever emerged. The crime looked almost identical to the Camp Scott murders. Another story was from a woman who claims that she would have been the 4th girl in the tent. She said she had been to the camp several times, and that there was a board that they'd laid across and crushed down a fence, and that the Girl Scout camp and the Boy Scout camp, which is 1.3 miles away from each other, according to what I've looked at on the map, but she said they would dare each other to streak across and scare each other. The Boy Scouts would come over and scare the Girl Scouts would go over and scare the Boy Scouts. There were 3 boys that were talked about that a lot of people considered suspect, but the fact of the matter is that there wasn't any evidence to support it at all. All the evidence really surrounded Jean Leroy Hart. Further stories emerged that Jean Leroy Hart was sleeping with one of the police officer's wives, and that the police officer had it out for Hart. And the best way to get back at Hart was to frame him, plant the evidence. I personally think this is really stretching it. There were several agencies involved in the investigation. And while we've all heard about the thin blue line, I believe that a concerted effort between all the branches of law enforcement agencies that were involved to frame Hart is just a little bit unlikely. And probably if you believe that, you probably believe O.J. Simpson's story too. In closing, I want to offer my sympathies to anybody who's ever been touched by this tragic event, because it continues to reverberate over 40 years later. I also happen to believe that the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts, for that matter, are a really great organization. There have been literally hundreds of thousands of campouts since the 20s, with only this case and the Margaret Beck incident. Now, of course, one is enough. However, given what children and young teenagers get out of being a scout, it's my hope that the tradition of scouting does continue for many years to come. Of course, we have learned several valuable lessons in all of this, and it's my hope that this case will eventually be put to rest in spite of the shortcomings of the evidence that we are left with. Remember that before DNA, convictions were based on circumstantial evidence, testimony, eyewitnesses, and sometimes confessions. Camp Scott is closed, and if a tree fell at Camp Scott today, probably nobody would be around to hear it. If someone suddenly confessed to the murders of the 3 girls that night, my question is, would anyone hear it? Till next time, take care of each other and keep rock alive.